Hello and welcome to Must Read Fiction, a place for people who know that life is better with a novel in hand. I'm Erin Popelka, and I'm delighted to be here today with author Emily Adrian. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Emily Adrian is the author of Everything Here is Under Control and the second season, this gorgeous book we are going to talk about today, as well as two critically acclaimed novels for young adults. Originally from Portland, Oregon, Emily currently lives in New Haven, Connecticut with her husband, son, and her dog named Hank. So, Emily, let's start with the second season. Please tell me about the book.
Yeah. So the book was sort of it grew out of an obsession with basketball that I developed in the years after I gave birth to my son. Um, I spent a year sort of preoccupied with bodies. Um, because there was this little baby infant body, and he was so vulnerable and fragile. And I was very aware of being the person who was supposed to care for and preserve that tiny little human. And then I was also aware of my own body in a way I had never been, because I had never been seriously injured and I'd never been through anything as violent as childbirth, to be really blunt. And it occurred to me that and I think a lot of us have sort of organized our modern lives in such a way that allows us to really deny how dependent we are on our bodies. And meanwhile, I had this sort of growing obsession with basketball. And like with any professional sport, if you watch it long enough, you will see some really gruesome things happen on live TV. Um, and so, as much as sports are a sort of unabashed celebration of the body, they also reveal like how fragile and vulnerable bodies are. And so I started to sort of develop this idea to write a book that braided together the violence and wonders of motherhood with the violence and wonders of professional sports. And I was kind of looking for a way in to that theme, or to that sort of interrogation of those two things. And I became really interested in this sideline reporter named Doris Burke. Um, and when I found out that she was also a mother, and that her career and her parenthood had at times been in conflict in a way that really weighed on her, I knew that that was my way into the story.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. What an interesting pair of like set of questions and kind of a combination there. I love that those came together in the book. And the book is like a really fun read in that like it's the language is really quick and snappy, and it feels like as you're reading it like you're watching a professional basketball
Mhm.
game. It's got that like announcer feel, like things happening in real time, which was like a really fantastic trick. And so I really wanted to know, like, so it was fun to read in that way. What was the most fun part about writing the book?
I think you kind of just said it. I think that trying to put the energy of a professional sports game into a novel in a way that was still literary, that still scanned as, prose, as a sort of lyrical fictional experience, was just really interesting. And it was really fun to watch basketball and focus on what the announcers were saying and not just what was happening on the floor, because they do all have very different styles of announcing basketball games. And some of them are more lyrical, and some of them sort of say these things that you wouldn't necessarily expect a sports announcer to say. So I had fun developing not only like the narrative voice of the book, but Ruth's voice as a basketball reporter and as an analyst. And sort of walking that line between making it believably rooted in the game of basketball, but also really fun to read if you are simply a fan of fiction, which is a really fun tension to build into the book and to play with as an author.
Oh, absolutely. And how did that change your relationship to watching like basketball and professional sports? Like, did it make it better, or were you like, oh, now I really have to like take notes and pay attention? Like, how did that change your relationship there?
Well, I think it was just really fun. Like it was genuinely the most fun I've ever had writing a book. Because basketball is just a really good time. And it was fun to think about it from that angle and to really ask myself, like, there's the game that's happening on the court, and then there's the sort of narrative that is being shaped by the announcers and the people like in the production truck at ESPN, and then there is the final result on your screen at home. So thinking about it on all those different levels was just a sort of like fun and immersive way to watch a basketball game. And now that I'm not writing the book, I'm kind of back to watching basketball as a sports fan and not obsessing with like what's going on in the locker room or, what's going to happen at the press conference afterward. But at the time it was just really fun. And it felt like I felt a little bit like an insider because I just knew so much about broadcasting. I ended up learning so much more about what goes on behind the scenes than the average fan knows.
Oh, that's awesome. Oh my gosh, I love that so much. And you've talked a little bit about this main character, Ruth Devon, who is, kind of a sideline analyst, kind of a sideline reporter for the National Basketball Association, the NBA. And she's in this like very male dominated space. And she also really loves basketball. And I wanted to know just a little bit more about like why you chose to explore a woman and sports, especially professional sports, which are often so male dominated.
Well, as I mentioned, I became fascinated with this real life reporter named Doris Burke. And I remember a few years before I had really gotten into basketball, I was sort of a casual fan. Like I would watch it over my husband's shoulder. I was sort of fascinated by his fascination more than I was a real fan myself. And I remember watching a sort of a post-game interview after a championship game a few years back. And Doris Burke was interviewing LeBron James. And, they make a funny pair physically. Like she is very small and blonde and bespectacled. And he is towering and just like very especially after a basketball game, you're very aware of him as a sort of like god-like athlete. And what struck me about watching them together was that he was so comfortable with her and he was so excited to talk to her, like in the aftermath of this huge win. And I really wanted to know like how she had sort of proven herself to him and to the other players and to the league to the point where she is clearly everyone's favorite reporter. And I just had a lot of fun sort of not only learning about that experience in her own words, because she has given interviews, there is a lot of research that I did about her, but also just sort of imagining it beyond the bounds of my own research. Trying to put myself in her shoes and imagine her navigating that world.
Well, as a reader, I feel like you nailed it. I could definitely sort of feel that relationship between Ruth Devon and the players and that like collegiality and that respect. Certainly compared to some of the other characters too, right? It even feels special and, from a first person narrative. So that was a lot of fun to get to do as a reader. I guess kind of on a more personal level, like what sports, you've talked about loving basketball. Are there other sports you love or have you been an athlete and how did that find its way into the book?
I did not grow up interested in sports at all. I grew up in a pretty athletic family, though. One of my brothers was an NBA fanatic, all his life. And I then married somebody who's also just deeply into sports and especially into basketball. And so basketball was always the sport, like where if it was on, I would watch it growing up. And I knew the rules basically, and I knew some of the players, and I was more likely to watch it than any other sport. But the older I got, the more, I mentioned this before, but I became just very fascinated by my husband's fascination with the NBA because he's not a guy who seeks out like a lot of entertainment in general. He's not interested, in like trashy TV or formulaic narratives really. So, but he'll watch an NBA game like on the edge of his seat. And so when I started to develop my own interest in basketball and to start to think about this book and what it would mean to write a sports novel, I felt like I just really needed to know what it was to be a fan. Like I needed to become the kind of person whose heart can be broken by an NBA Finals game. And I thought that it would be sort of like method acting or something. I thought I would like, officially remain a little bit dispassionate and keep it at arm's length, but I would understand, I would have some, profound insight into the mind of a sports fan. But what really happened is that I just became one very quickly. Basketball is just so much fun and it's very accessible. There's not a lot of, there are some sort of arcane rules, but it doesn't even really matter in the beginning if you know all of them. Like you can follow it, but it's just on a very basic level that remains very exciting and thrilling. Um, so I became a fan. And then it's funny that you ask if I am an athlete, because I do think that this book sort of like awakened the athlete inside of me. During the process of writing it, I started running really, really seriously. And I do play basketball with my kid and with my husband sometimes, just messing around at the park. And I love it. And now in hindsight, I'm a little bit dismayed and sad for like my younger self that I thought that being, more of a bookish, like aspiring writer type kid meant that sports were closed off to me. I wish now that I had sort of felt more comfortable and unself-conscious exploring that side of myself.
Yeah, well, it's never too late to start from one athlete to another.
Yeah.
I'm a swimmer, and you too can be a master swimmer. You just have to be over the age of 18 and join master swimming. So if swimming
Yeah.
is, your bag too, like welcome. It is a
Yeah.
wonderful space for all comers. So
I love to swim, and my son, who's 4, is just learning to swim unassisted. Like he's not going to drown now. He has like the basics, and he's just learning to really like propel himself through the water by himself. And he's so proud, and I love swimming with him. I will take him swimming any time of day, no matter where we are, no matter how cold it is.
oh, amazing. Well, may you all have many, many more days swimming together. Oh, I love that so much. And that actually like leads a little bit into my last question, because you have also written for young adults, which I know is not 4-year-olds. It's a very different genre. But wanted to just kind of close asking about what you learned from those 2 books that you wrote for young adults, and what you brought to your now 2 books for adults.
I think that the theme of adolescence, of becoming the person that you are going to be, is in all of my books. Even in this book, it's probably in there the least, but Ruth's daughter is a teenager. She is 18. She has just graduated from high school, and writing her character was so easy for me because I have so much experience writing people that age. And it was kind of refreshing because Ruth is 42. She's about 10 years older than I am in real life. So that was more of a stretch where I had to sort of make sure that like her internal, monologue was like realistic for somebody who was older than me. And especially for somebody who is at a very different phase of motherhood than I am. So it was fun to both like challenge myself in thinking about different phases of life, and then also bring in that aspect that I'm so familiar with in writing about teenagers. The other thing, though, that I think has really, the thing about writing YA that has really helped me as I sort of pivot into the adult literary world, is just YA is so dependent on plot and pacing and dialogue, because it's for a younger audience, and it's for an age group that isn't necessarily inclined to sit down with a book. You really have to know how to hold their attention. Like no matter what you want to write about, no matter how literary or serious you want to be, you have to be entertaining. Like you have to be able to tell your reader a story that they're really going to be invested in from page 1. And I like to think that I honed that skill writing YA and then brought it into this more adult literary context, and that people really pick up on that and appreciate it.
Yeah. Oh, that makes so much sense. And you can see still, like in the second season, like it does strike a very literary chord and explore some of those big questions, like we were talking about at the beginning, like questions of bodies and questions of injury, and how we use those bodies and how we create relationships and respect and all of those pieces, while also being incredibly entertaining. So certainly, I can see how those skills came forward. Well, Emily Adrian, thank you. Thank you so very much for writing the second season, this fantastic book I have in my hands. And thank you for taking the time to speak with me about it today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful.